How would you describe what's going on in Gaza at the moment?
Genocide, it's not war. When you make war against a population, that's genocide. Uh, we always, we use that term to describe the conflict, but it's pretty much a misnomer. Hamas, which is a resistance force, but it doesn't have any armored units or Navy, Air Force, artillery, uh, tanks. It's so lightly armed uh, that every time Israel carries out one of its periodic assaults against Gaza, it's butchery. And of course, most of the casualties, both in the past and then certainly in the present, are civilians. Hamas is largely sheltered in tunnels. U.S. intelligence estimates that only a third of its force has been killed. Meanwhile, we're seeing literally hundreds of Palestinians wounded and killed a day. And just to put that in perspective, I was in Sarajevo during the war. So we were hit with 300 to 400 shells a day. That resulted in about 4 to 5 dead a day or 2 dozen wounded a day. Compare that to Gaza, and you begin to understand the level of decimation and bombing, which is like it's unlike anything we've seen. So you'd have to go back to Vietnam. With this caveat, Gaza is tiny. It's only 20 miles long and 5 miles wide. So it's a live streamed genocide.
In your recent column, A Genocide Foretold, you have kind of argued that the assault on Gaza and the resistance by Palestinians' freedom struggle represent the kind of global divide between the imperialist Western power on one hand and the resistance for the global South on the other hand. Um, why do you think Gaza represents this long-standing global divide?
Well, two reasons. One, Western governments, which I would count Israel as certainly part of that group, these industrial fortresses, uh, have stopped playing by any rules. We saw that for 20 years in the Middle East. Preemptive war under post Nuremberg laws is a criminal war of aggression. Israel just bombed the consulate in Damascus. The United States carries out those kind of attacks across the demarcation lines of other countries all the time. Nobody is held accountable. That's the first part. So it's a world in which the powerful no longer even pretend to play by rules. Number two, with the rise of uh, the climate crisis, the mass migrations, the decline in crop yields, the flooding, the wildfires, things are becoming harder and harder for those in the global south. And the response of the industrialized north will be no different from the response in Gaza as things deteriorate. And I think many people in the global south have figured that out. First of all, many of them in India, Kenya, all sorts of countries, were themselves victors of settler colonial projects, so they get it. I think one of the reasons Yemen, which is the only country to respond in a meaningful way to the genocide, they in their very recent history through this Saudi-U.S. siege lost 30,000 people to starvation, cholera epidemics. So within their immediate memory, they know exactly what the Palestinians are going through. But within even the kind of uh, the long trauma that's been passed down by settler colonial states like Great Britain in India, there's an acute awareness that this is very similar to what they remember. The British orchestrated a huge famine in India by seizing all of the local grain stores and building railroads to ship all the wheat out. So it's, I think the global South's response to what's happening in Palestine comes from historical memory and from a realization that as things deteriorate, they are not immune in any way from being treated like this.
Tell us a little bit about your reading of the popular protest in the U.S. and its influence on Washington as far as this genocide, as far as Washington's support in this genocide is concerned.
Well, it's had a rhetorical influence. It hasn't had any influence in terms of the pipeline between the United States and Israel, but I think it's about 68% of munitions that Israel uses, because they've depleted their stocks, are now coming from the United States. So that pipeline has not in any way been disrupted, nor will it be disrupted. But it has frightened the Biden administration, because all of the opinion polls between Biden and Trump uh, uh, are, the differences are like 1, 2, 3%. They're very small. So he can't afford to lose much. He's alienated the Muslim American community in the United States. He's alienated the youth who largely have driven these demonstrations. I mean, that's what's been so heartening, having attended several of them, is that they are driven by young men and women in their 20s, very young. And not only have they been sustained over a long period of time, but they haven't diminished in terms of numbers. And so that frightens, I think, the Democratic Party, that is running an election that's on a razor's edge. But in terms of actually affecting policy, getting the United States to shut off the arms supplies, the weapon supplies, we just shipped F-35 fighters to Israel, that's not going to happen. And unfortunately, that means the genocide will continue. So there's been a rhetorical shift, but there hasn't been a meaningful shift, and there won't be.
During the Vietnam War protests, the protests did yield results. I mean, there were economic reasons at the time, because of increasing U.S. deficit, its problem with the gold standard, and so on and so forth, but also the conscription. American soldiers are fighting on ground. We are not seeing that here. Is this why so many protests, whether it's the university campus or organized labor, in this particular case, doesn't yield anything? What was the reason?
Well, the reason is the Israel lobby, which is a powerful political force in the United States. And let's never forget that Biden in the Senate was the largest recipient of money from AIPAC, from the Zionist lobby, to date. And he left the Senate a while ago to serve as vice president and now be president. So uh, they cannot alienate the Zionist lobby. That's why the weapons won't stop. The Vietnam War was very different. You had middle class kids, because there was a draft, coming home in body bags in pretty high numbers, um, and uh, and so the ferment, the political ferment on the streets was far more pronounced, and far more, and saw a rise of a series of anti-war candidates, including George McGovern, who won the Democratic nomination in 1972. Now you saw both the establishment wing of the Democratic Party and the Republican Party join forces to defeat McGovern, much as we have seen the establishment wing of the Republican Party and the Democratic Party join forces against Trump, which exposes the fact that they're really just one big ruling party. Um, uh, so it is different. I think that these protests are not as uh, they're not as threatening to the political establishment as the Vietnam War. Remember, the political system itself was being changed under assault. We also, which is a kind of footnote often, but shouldn't be, there were a series of revolts within the military of soldiers who refused to serve. I think it was an estimated 25% of officers were killed with fragging. That means they were shot by their own soldiers. So there was, we were facing also mutinous conditions within the armed forces.
How do you look at the constant Israeli attempt to extend this conflict, if you like, to Iran essentially and their allies? You mentioned about the recent attack on the Iranian consulate in Damascus. This was followed after the air raid in Aleppo. There has been constant provocations along the Lebanon-Israeli border. Two hypotheses have been proposed that I have read. One is that it somehow benefits Netanyahu, who is himself facing a lot of troubles in his own constituency. And the other is that American support when it comes to the Iranian policy is very, very solid. So while Americans can say that we don't support the attacks on the aid workers, when it comes to Iran, it's an ironclad support. Uh, how do you look at this Israeli constant provocation to expand the war beyond Palestine?
Well, the Israelis have long prodded or attempted to prod the United States, going all the way back to the Bush administration, into a war with Iran. And remember that the Israel lobby was fundamental to pushing the United States into a war with Iraq. All of these neocons, Wolfowitz, Pearl, Louis Scooter Libby, they were also extremely close to the Zionist lobby. So it's a very foolish, dangerous provocation. I think the restraint has been shown not by Israel, of course, but or even the United States, which has deployed warships to the Persian Gulf, but by Iran and by Hezbollah. Hezbollah does not want a repeat of 1982 in Lebanon, where West Beirut was flattened by the Israeli Air Force. Iran is very wary about getting into a direct conflict. They will do it through proxies, like through Hezbollah. So I think that's where the restraint has come from. However, Israel keeps pushing and baiting Iran, provoking Iran to respond. They are going to have to respond somehow. How calibrated that response will be will determine whether we escalate the conflict or not. But I would say that certainly since October 7th, Hezbollah and Iran have shown incredible restraint. The real acts of resistance have come, as I said before, from Yemen, almost solely from Yemen. Yes, it's true that Hezbollah has shelled the northern part of Israel, and I think 80,000 Israelis have had to move, and a few people have been killed. But given the capacity that Hezbollah militarily has, they have shown tremendous restraint.
There are some, including not as much military experts, like I'm thinking of people like Norman Finkelstein, who says that the combined power of Hezbollah, Iran, and the other allies it has in the region would be something that Israeli army cannot match. Do you buy that argument?
Well, I don't. I think that any conflict between Israel and Iran would be in the air. I don't see Iranian troops storming through Syria to attack Israel. So as long as it is essentially an aerial conflict, no, I would disagree. Um, and I don't see Hezbollah storming over the northern border of Israel into Israel either. So I think what we're talking about is perhaps a ground incursion by Israel into southern Lebanon. But I don't see this as a war actually between armies. Logistically, I'm not sure how that would work. And number one. Number two, I don't think they want it. So I'm not sure I agree with that analysis because Israel supplied by, Israel supplied by the United States, as we've seen in Gaza, can sustain over the long period a pretty formidable air campaign.
I want to move to other areas, but just a final question on the Middle East. We had Ambassador Chas Freeman, and he argued that, as you just said, that the American involvement in Iraq was significantly instigated by Israel. Thinking about, you have been covering the Middle East for a long time, thinking about American involvement in the region and the instability it has created all over, uh, is it fair to blame just Israel when it comes to the American involvement in the region?
No, I don't think. I think Israel and the United States were full partners in these debacles, but they were full partners, and we had Israel. I mean, there's all sorts of fingerprints of Israel in Iraq, including in Abu Ghraib. So uh, yeah, I'm not saying that Israel was the sole engine for what happened in Iraq, but it was an important and a primary player in terms of pushing the United States into the war. Remember, we're talking about the first Iraq war, the invasion of Iraq. There was a heavy opposition within the State Department, the CIA, even within the military. The Arabists were not behind this war, and so what you had is Dick Cheney, who was Secretary of Defense, creating his own kind of rogue unit to cook intelligence to pass it on to the White House. And Israel was deeply involved in that. That's a little caveat that I think a lot of people miss, that the establishment was not supportive of the war. And I know that because I was brought to these institutions to speak against the war, including the State Department at West Point. And they knew what I was going to say. They couldn't say it, but they knew what I was going to say. And Israel was deeply involved in all of that. That subterfuge, those lies about weapons of mass destruction, the whole fantasy of first Baghdad and then Tehran. Israel was deeply involved in all of that. And the architects of the war had very, very close links to Israel and the Zionist lobby.
It is said that somewhere in the middle of the 1990s, during the Clinton administration, there was a shift in American foreign policy in the Middle East from balancing Iran and Iraq to double containment of Iran and Iraq. And it is said that Israel was very significant in pushing forward this shift in American policy in the region.
Yeah, that's correct. And of course, it it ended up being completely counterproductive because what it did is solidify a Shiite alliance between Baghdad and Tehran, and so the balance is gone. In many ways, Iran won the war, quite literally because we forget that with ISIS, which is Sunni, when they rose up, they were militarily increasingly dominant, and you had all sorts of Iranian militias and probably Iranian uh, revolutionary guard forces crossing the border. There was a tacit alliance at a certain point between the United States and Iran to defeat ISIS and the Caliphate, and Iran played a significant part of that. And the Americans would I mean visually even see Iranian units and not fire on them because they were in tacit alliance. So and what we saw is because of course before under Saddam Hussein the Sunni minority dominated Iraq and was very pro-Western, and that has changed.
Hi,
Right.
my name is Ayushman. I, along with Jyotisman, have started this platform. In the last 2 years, we have tried to build content for the left and progressive forces. We have interviewed economists, historians, political commentators, and activists so far. If you have liked our content so far and want us to build an archive for the left, I have two requests for you. Please do consider donating for the cause. Link is in the description below. Also, if you are not able to do so, don't feel sad. You can always like our videos and share our videos to your comrades. Finally, don't forget to hit the subscribe button.